Hi, welcome to the Legislative Section Training DVD. My name is Bob Rhodes and I'm the Legislative Section Facilitator Trainer.
Hi, and I'm Dan Lewis. I am one of your conference co-secretaries.
Legislative sections are a really important part of our annual conference, where we take up a whole lot of the legislation that we do at annual conference and split it up into some different groups, which enables us to be a lot more efficient in the way we handle legislation at annual conference.
And this DVD that you're watching now will outline the steps that are required to set up for the legislative sections and then what's required during the legislative sections. We hope this is a benefit to you.
At the legislative team meeting, facilitators will be paired up with an auditor and given the what, when, and where of their legislative section. Facilitators will be given a script for explaining the discussion guidelines and especially the legislation to be discussed. The facilitators and auditors are assigned to a district superintendent and a hospitality person. Materials and paperwork will be provided to the facilitators and auditors, and it is the responsibility of those facilitators and auditors to transport those materials to the legislative section and then return them once the legislative section has concluded, including and especially all legislative paperwork. The facilitator trainer and the legislative section coordinator will announce at this meeting where they will be following the legislative sections so that all materials can be returned in a timely manner. Following this meeting, facilitators and auditors are encouraged to meet together to discuss the responsibilities and time frame for each piece of legislation. Please consider in this conversation time allotted for amendments or for prayer time and reflection. Facilitators will need to review each piece of legislation to determine whether it should be read completely or summarized in a neutral manner.
45 minutes before the section start time, the facilitator and auditor need to set up the space. You'll need to post a sign that has your legislative section number outside the door of your room so people can find it. Inside, post the provided poster on the walls that explain the discussion guidelines, the voting options, and agenda. The hospitality person at the legislative section has an important job. As the members come in, they will check them in and check their name badges. For each person has a number on their badge that correlates with that legislative group. If the number does not match, they don't have voice nor do they have vote. It's good to encourage them to go to the proper legislative section. Also, that hospitality person will be distributing action item list of the things to be covered during that time, voting cards, and also discussion guidelines. A representative from a group sponsoring legislation may be present during your section. It's their responsibility to identify themselves to you. It is also important for you to recruit 2 or 3 vote counters from the people gathered, and these people are supposed to be legitimate voting members of your legislation section.
At the beginning of the legislative section, it's important to introduce those who will be offering leadership for that legislative section. The facilitator will be a neutral presenter of guidelines and legislation and the facilitator of discussion. The district superintendent acts not only as parliamentarian, but is also responsible for all that comes out of the legislative section. There will be an auditor. This person receives and reports the votes and calculates the outcome. There will be a hospitality person who will welcome legislative participants as they arrive, who will also act as a timekeeper, helping to keep the entire section on time. There will be vote counters who are responsible for vote counting. They are voting participants and they report to the auditor. Finally, there may be legislative resource persons for any given piece of legislation. This person is there to offer information on a piece of legislation, but not to engage in the dialogue. They may answer questions only. Be sure that all voting participants have the necessary copies of the discussion guidelines, the action items, and their voting cards. At this point, it's a good idea to explain the discussion guidelines, perhaps using the poster that will be provided in your room. Everyone allowed to vote in the legislative section is allowed to participate in the discussion. Discussion should be divided between for and against, and each speech should be no more than 2 minutes. Avoid interrupting and contain comments to the discussion at hand. Speak to the matter being discussed and not about individuals. Avoid side conversations. Give feedback to the facilitator. Be respectful of all persons and make sure you share all ideas. Discussion, remember, should be fair and balanced, and a facilitator must be neutral. Present the legislation in the time frame allotted for each. Remember that completing your legislative section on time is very important.
So now it's time to get going with our legislative information. First, present the action item before you. And whether you read that completely or paraphrase it for the group, please be as neutral as possible. If they are present, this would be the time to invite the resource person to give their objective background information or clarification about the action item.
Once the action item has been presented, discussion will begin. The facilitator will call on those who'd like to speak, reminding them to speak in such a way that they can be heard throughout the space. It might be a good idea to address informational questions at the beginning of each discussion time, and then trying to alternate between speeches for and against. One way to do that would be to invite people to state their position at the beginning of their speech. If an amendment is suggested, the amendment must be seconded before the person who suggests the amendment may speak to it. The resource person may present whether or not that amendment is a friendly amendment. Once an amendment is formally presented, discussion is only on the amendment and not on the original action item. Then the amendment is voted on, which only takes a simple majority, 50% plus 1. If an amendment passes, discussion going forward is only on the amended action item. If the amendment fails, then the discussion is on the original action item. At the end of the time allotted, or when discussion is finished, the facilitator may call the vote. Before voting can begin, please lead the entire section in a moment of silence for reflection and prayer.
Be sure to review these voting guidelines before each vote. Concurrence is a vote in agreement with the action item. It requires 80% majority. That action item is placed on the consent calendar. Non-concurrence is a vote against the action item. This requires an 80% majority, and the action item is placed on the consent calendar for non-concurrence. Concurrence with amendment, that requires 80% majority as amended, and that action item is sent to the floor of the conference for discussion and vote. No recommendation. Anytime an 80% majority cannot be reached, the action item goes to the floor of the conference for discussion and vote. Remind voting participants that abstention votes are not counted, nor are they calculated into the percentage of votes for the action item. When it becomes time to take the vote on the action item, a paper ballot may be requested, and if so, pencils and white paper will be provided for this, and the vote counters will collect the papers and give them to the auditor. Whichever way the vote is taken, paper or by the show of hands, the vote counters will report to the auditor, who will then tally the votes and determine which action has been taken, whether that be concurrence, non-concurrence, or no recommendation. The auditor reports this information to the facilitator, who announces it to the section. Then the auditor completes the necessary forms to be delivered to the legislative section coordinator immediately following that section. Once you've completed these steps for an action item, and you've tallied the votes and recorded them, then you return to the beginning of that process for each individual action item before your legislative section.
At the close of the legislative section, it's important to thank all those who've participated, and especially to thank the leaders, the district superintendents, the hospitality person, the auditors, the facilitator, the vote counters, and the resource persons. Announce that the results of all legislative sections will be posted and presented to the full body of the conference. Remind them that any item added to the consent calendar can be removed with a motion on the floor of the conference and the support of at least 50 persons. If there are no final questions, ask the participants to turn in all voting materials and discussion guidelines to the hospitality person as they exit. Finally, close the section with prayer and dismiss.
Now comes the cleanup. Please complete all of your paperwork, collect all of the supplies, the posters, markers, calculator, voting cards, and anything else, and the room should be left in the same or better condition than you found it. All necessary paperwork and gathered supplies must be returned immediately to the facilitator trainer or the legislative section coordinator. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Your participation in this process is very important and we appreciate it.
Remember, if you have any questions after watching this DVD, there is a Q&A session, a dinner session at annual conference, usually the evening before legislative sections. You'll receive more information about that from the legislative section facilitator trainer. Thank you.